What didn't exist in the 1930s and what does exist in the 2020s are these things called platform business models. And these platform business models are kind of powerful. The way that contract employees work with platforms, which is basically these gig economy workers, is different. One of the big benefits of being a W-2 employee versus 1099 is that you have unemployment protection. There is no model for contractors, 1099 employees to pay into a program like this.
There's two types of labor classifications in the U.S. You're a W-2 employee or you are a 1099 contractor, right? We've spoken many, many times on the show about how actually a need for a new class of labor worker. We've had some guests on the show to talk about this. We've spoken about California AB 5 law, which was supposedly there to help the gig workers, but it was really a far cry from doing that. And I think that was really just a facade, a sham. And instead, just California wanted to get more money for itself at really the expense of the gig economy workers. Anyway, so we've spoken about the need for a third classification of labor worker because the rules for 1099 have been around for decades. And the way that contract employees work with platforms, which is basically these gig economy workers, is different. And we've spoken about that many times on the show. So anyway, there are about 30 million people unemployed in the United States. In February of 2020, before Corona, we had maybe around 165 million people in the labor force. There's actually a record high number of people working in the labor force. Unemployment measures the number of people actively or trying to look for a job. You could still be out of the workforce, but not technically looking for a job and not be considered unemployed. So that's a whole other thing in terms of what do these, what do these different metrics from the Department of Labor mean? But just for this conversation, we're going to talk about unemployment rates. So there's about 30 million people total unemployed in the United States as of mid-June when the last reading of numbers came out. 17.6 million of those were collecting regular state benefits. What that means is those would be W-2 employees, which no longer have a job, i.e. they're unemployed, and now they qualify for traditional unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits that come from the state. Now you have, according to this, with this pandemic unemployment assistance program, about 12.9 million Americans are collecting unemployment benefits through this program. So what is this program? The PUA basically provides a support system, kind of like unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits, as if you were a W-2 employee and you no longer have work, but it's for people that would be contractors, many of whom would be gig economy workers, right? So that means you work for Uber and you drive for Uber, you work for Uber Eats or Instacart or Lyft or any of these, gig economy platforms, or let's say you're a contractor on Angie's List, right? I mean, or any of the Handy, right? Any of these kind of like labor service marketplaces, right? So if you work for them, you get paid as a 1099 contractor. Now, that means that you don't pay the same amount of monies into unemployment programs, right? So when you're a W-2 employee, you look at your pay stub, you will see that you are paying money in for unemployment benefits. And so is the company. So companies that are paying W-2 employees, they're paying payroll taxes. And as a part of those payroll taxes, they're putting in dollars for unemployment wages and an allocation, right? So that money kind of goes into an account and accrues, and the state and the federal government can draw down from that to provide these unemployment benefit programs, right? So it's offset by the employee and the employer. 1099 programs are different. That's why we saw in California, the AB 5 law was trying to force more 1099 workers to be classified as W-2 employees. Why? Because California wanted to get more money. More money from whom, would you ask? Well, one would be employers, as I mentioned. 1099 contractors, the employer doesn't pay payroll taxes, right? So the state isn't getting that money. Now, some of that is offset by the 1099 contractor and the monies that they're paying, but it's not the same. Net, you'll make more money as the state if you're getting W-2 fees, both from payroll taxes from the employer, A, and B, just compliance. So it's much harder to enforce a 1099 contractor. Are they actually paying the right amount of money? Is that money actually flowing through back to the state as it should be, or the city, et cetera? So enforcement and payroll taxes would be my overgeneralization of why states want more employees to be classified as W-2 employees rather than 1099 workers. Reason why this is important is because now the federal government, because of coronavirus, has put this PUA program into existence. And so it's providing dollars for these contractor workers that no longer have jobs. So 31.5 million, that's the total stat as of mid-June. We got a little chart here. This chart is not actually comparing apples to apples, not surprisingly these days. So it's saying, hey, look at the unemployment rate as a percentage of the overall labor force. We've got that 165 million stat, right, from February. You got about 25% in the peak of the Great Depression back in the early 1930s. Now they say, hey, April 20, we hit 14.7%. June, we're down to 11%. That 11% stat is only looking at the 17.6 million Americans collecting regular state unemployment benefits, i.e. the W-2 workers now unemployed. Now, that is apples to apples in that respect. But if we want, what didn't exist in the 1930s and what does exist in the 2020s are these things called platform business models. And these platform business models are kind of powerful. That's why you have a huge amount of these roughly 13 million people on this PUA program are qualifying for this assistance. So you can get $167 per week starting February 2nd of 2020 through basically the end of this year through December of 2020. From March 29 through July 25th, you can get an additional $600 per week, right? So basically through the end of July of 2020, if you're put out for work because of coronavirus. Now, these are the minimum payments. If you submit your, let's say your tax filing or, your proof of income that you would put on your taxes or whatever it may be, you can prove in 2019 that you were making more than $17,368, then you will get more than that $167 per week stipend, basically, right? The maximum is $450 per week, and you need to be making more than $46,700 to qualify for that, right? So it's basically saying, hey, if you were making more than $47,000 annually in 2019, you can get the $450 a week in unemployment benefits from this PUA program. Now, you're an independent contractor. You're a gig economy worker. You didn't have to pay into that program. This is the only reason this is happening. Technically, this money is coming from the state, but that money is ultimately being underwritten by the federal government. And we're doing this because it's a pandemic and an emergency and all these kinds of things. But there is no model for contractors, 1099 employees to pay into a program like this to provide. One of the big benefits of being a W-2 employee versus 1099 is that you have unemployment protection, right? So that doesn't exist for 1099 contractors outside of this current pandemic. So it's just very interesting if we think about this part of the labor pool, its expansion since the 1930s. You look at this article here saying, oh, well, in June we had 11% of the labor force was unemployed. Actually, net, when you include the full number of both the W-2 unemployed people and the 1099 unemployed people, you're actually around 19%. So it's actually not as pretty as 11. Now, there's variance in that, right? You don't really know of the 13 million people that that are on PUA benefit programs? Were they working full time, or were they working full time but doing gig economy work, getting paid as a 1099 contractor? Or were they, working 5 or 10 hours a week here or there, which according to Uber is the average amount of time that a driver drives for them on a weekly basis is I think 10 hours, right? It's very like supplemental income. So it'd be interesting. We don't understand exactly full of that 13 million people. To what degree are these people out of work? It's certainly for a material amount of them is certainly going to be a material impact to them. But the point is, we're much higher than 11% because our economy and our labor force makeup is very different than how it was 90 years ago, as you kind of look at these charts. So again, the platform economy skewing a lot of these traditional metrics. We've spoken about this before on the show, how I think inflation calculations are skewed because they're not factoring in the platform dynamics that are coming in. We've spoken about unemployment rates being skewed. This is another, I think, great example of that. Hi, this is Alex from Winner Take All. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the content. Feel free to leave a comment, ask us questions, and definitely make sure to join us on our next live stream.